speaker. Our next speaker is Eben Tomlinson. He is the Director of Sales and Marketing at Semaphore Solutions. He has over 20 years experience designing, implementing, and working with business critical informatics systems across all manners of regulated industries. His work blends a computer science background with over a decade experience in life science laboratory informatics, resulting in pragmatic solutions to intractable problems. His talk title is Future-Proofing Informatics, Building a Resilient Life Science Data Platform. Eben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Let's get this thing pulled up here. So,
looks good.
Screen's up. We're looking good. Yep. Let's get running. So, welcome everyone, and thanks, John, Aaron, and team from Visioneers for pulling us all together to share our experiences. My name is Evan, as John said, and I work for Semaphore Solutions, makers of the informatics platform Labit. My career has been tracking through regulated informatics and software for about 20 years now, through roles both technical and non. And I've worked in life sciences with Semaphore for just over a decade now. And for the last 5 years or so, I've been leading the go-to-market motion, or the sales process, for our new lab informatics platform, Labit. Prior to that, I was the technical program manager for all of Semaphore Solutions services. So that spans everything from third-party informatics implementing someone else's LIMS, to integration and custom software development as necessary to fill gaps in feature capabilities across informatics that are utilized throughout labs, diagnostic, pharma, biotech, etc. Suffice to say, I've got a lot of war stories from the pointy end of putting sample and specimen management systems into practice across a broad section of both life science labs and also different vendors' systems. I'm not going to come here today to tell you how to do sample and specimen management necessarily. That's something that you're already doing every day. You're here to learn about it. I think the important part is that you're improving incrementally all the time. Instead, I'm going to tell you about some of the lessons that we, Semaphore Solutions, a software development product company, learned as we were building what amounts to a future-proof data strategy as it can be realized in a product, in this case, Labit. Some of those lessons are applicable to you where you sit in your current space, and I think can be leveraged into sample and specimen management as you move through and change what it is you're doing and how you're supporting it. In particular, I really want to make sure that we pass along the lessons we learned about how you can create what amounts to a truly reusable data and metadata strategy in your lab. Most of the limitations and costs that are associated with the reuse of data today, that is the data captured from sample and specimen management, are artifacts of a certain software architecture that's pervasive but not strictly necessary any longer. I'm going to do my best to present practical starting places for all these things for you to explore, depending on where your organization's at today, but please reach out to me if there's something in there, but it just doesn't seem like it's enough. So why am I telling you all this? Why do I think this matters in the context of sample and specimen management? And why should you care about what I'm saying? I think this quote's pretty accurate. I'm not sure who said it. Maybe it was me. Not actually sure about that. But in a world disrupted by AI, and it's pretty clear that we're living in that space, your organization's future value has really shifted from the quality of the data you collect, which has never really been in question for most laboratories, but rather it's now focused on the reusability of the data you collect, because that's going to pay dividends over time as you start to pull your data back in. That's really the focus of what I'm going to be talking about. So in my work, I've always found that you really need to first settle on some common definitions, particularly with interdisciplinary work like informatics, because you could be coming into a different sector. Maybe a LIMS is what they're looking for. Maybe there's a different acronym that they're using for it. Maybe they don't know what a LIMS is and they're just asking for it because they think that's what they need. So let's start with, what precisely is lab informatics and how does it relate to sample and specimen management? The simplest way I think I can put it is that lab informatics is any software utilized in a lab for processing information. A bit more formally, though, it's the science of processing data for storage and retrieval. But there's a bit of a challenge in here. I think the formal definition, and that is the formal definition of informatics, it's information science. I think the definition's lacking the word reuse, because in my experience across all these years, being able to retrieve the data doesn't really mean anything if you can't reuse it for a new purpose easily, or if it's not something that people can access. So if the definition of informatics is processing for storage and retrieval and reuse, let's assume we accept that, it follows that informatics across life science labs amounts to capturing the data and metadata during the act of sample, specimen, and result management, as well as any ancillary processes that support that function, like freezer management, document quality, etc. And that will be accomplished across a whole spectrum of acronyms, ELNs, MESs, LISs, LESs, SDMSs, and the one that we all know and love, LIMSs, or the kind of the core of sample and specimen management. Fundamentally, all these tools can kind of come into being in one of two ways. You can buy them from a vendor like us, commercial off-the-shelf software. Maybe it's customized, maybe it has an out-of-the-box workflow that can be customized, or maybe you're just stuck with a static workflow. Or you've built them in-house, and you're getting exactly what you want out of that in-house team, but now you've also got a software function that you need to support as you're going through this. Ultimately, they're all, excuse me, ultimately, all of that software is designed to help labs do some segment of what they do and do that function really, really well. But the lines between those tools are getting a little bit blurry, and I think that's an important point that I'll bring up a bit later in my talk. Here's where the problems really start to crop up, though. Like, what does the reality of working with these tools in today's lab look like? And I've got an interesting view across a cross section of hundreds of labs over the last 5 years that I've spoken to, like in the high hundreds. What are the most common and intractable challenges? And critically, how can you avoid them? So the first one, like the results of these current approaches, essentially, the first major challenge is systems integration. I had a great talk with John about this yesterday, actually. Common to all organizations that I talk to is the need to connect one piece of software to another somehow. You need to create that end-to-end process. If you take nothing else away from this talk, please remember that you probably need to assign more budget to this area rather than less in any project that you work with. Think about it this way. You can have all of the rich and structured data that you want and all these fantastic features and functionality you want in any given piece of software anywhere in your organization. But at the end of the day, it's only going to be as good as the lowest common denominator in the entire system, the weakest link, if you will. And that weakest link is usually the integrations, because that's the area that receives the least amount of attention and budget during implementation and maintenance. I've seen it time and again. Somebody comes up, we've got this fantastic idea. We're going to incept this project. We're going to do an implementation. We're going to have a great integration strategy. We're going to have really good middleware, or maybe we're going to build up a message bus, or we're going to do APIs through an abstraction point or something like that, only for stakeholders to look at that and go, the dollar value is too big, pull something out. And usually it's the integrations that kind of take the hit in that space, because nobody wants to give up functionality directly in the lab and like, oh, we can just import and export and it'll be fine. It won't be fine, because that cutting that budget out, or taking the time away from that integration ends up making your integrations kind of equivalent to like a text message, or maybe a tweet's a better example. Limited in length, typically short, usually taken out of context, and sometimes it causes fights. So that's kind of your first challenge wrapped up, right? You're talking through like two cans in a string kind of an idea. The second challenge is due to the common approaches to developing software these days. With few exceptions, our product lab being one of them, most software today is built using what's called a relational database, or sometimes somewhat incorrectly called a SQL database, just to kind of orient people to it. So that is a database that uses row-based data tables that have indelible or hard constraints between rows and different tables. Those indelible constraints is one that programmers tend to rely on as they're building software on top of these data models. So if, for example, the data model can't change in that dimension, then the software doesn't need to accommodate that change, which then starts to result in a hard edge, or what I will call a hard edge in these pieces of software, the inability to change something foundational to how the system operates. Step back and think about this for a second, though. When was the last time you thought about your laboratory and said, this thing, that thing, this piece of this component right here, this part of how I think or do things, this is never going to change. I'm going to make it permanent, and then I'm going to build everything else on top of that permanent. Literally never. Everything in the lab can change. That's the fundamental source of friction between software people and lab people that I interact with. The software folks, the people that I went to school with and that I work with daily, they really want to identify the ways in which systems can't change so that they can avoid having to program for that complexity. And all the lab folks I know and love revel in finding new and novel ways for things to change. That's kind of the name of the game. That's what you're trying to do. How is this going to change? How can this change? Can this change in some way that's going to be, change the world, for example? At the end of the day, this approach to software, that is using a relational database and then building relatively rigid software on top of it, there are ways to not do that, but they're really complicated. Excuse me. It can be thought of as forcing the data and the metadata to kind of be stored separately. All of this whiz-bang visualization or a management feature that you loved in that piece of software, well, what happens when that software goes to end of life, for example? Without that software running, the linkages between the data just doesn't exist any longer. Like you're no longer paying for access to the software. So you've got the data, it's been exported, but the links don't exist anymore. They were in the software itself. And now all of a sudden you're stuck with CSV exports or maybe a database, a database dump, which at the end of the day is no better than spreadsheets if you don't have the tools that pull all that data together and present it in that rich format. This is the reason that every major lab company or pharma company on the planet, particularly the really big ones, probably own no less than one license of every single LIMS system out there. Because at the end of the day, it's more cost effective to keep that software running than it is to reverse engineer the data model so you can then import that data into the next platform, the next new tool. And all of this then results in what I think of as the final challenge for labs, which is unmet expectations, which in turn results in labs replatforming the systems. I've found it to be like every 4 to 7 years. It's not a hard number, but that's kind of what I'm hearing. And that's because they buy these platforms, you have these great expectations about what they're going to be able to accomplish for you, and then 4 or 5 years down the road, something new comes along and the whole cycle starts all over again. And this is because of those constraints I mentioned just now. Those constraints are in fact assumptions about a domain made by a software architect early in the life cycle of the software. Those assumptions are things that create hard edges and technical debt in that software, which then slow down the ability for the software vendor to start delivering more features or for the software team to deliver more features quickly because they have to re-architect the software to support change X, Y, or Z. Practically speaking, that's the reason you can't rename a sample table to be a specimen table at the data layer in a lot of LIMS is because the software architect at the outset assumed that those were the same thing rather than one potentially being the derivative of another. It's nothing you don't already know, but it's to reinforce the point that it's all about the data, which then brings up the question, what are we actually all trying to achieve in sample and specimen management? I've got AI up on the screen because it's a relatively easy answer in this case because of the hype cycle surrounding AI. Everyone's envisioning what you can do with the reams of data that you're getting back from your samples this magical question of like, once we have a good enough AI, or maybe more accurately, an LLM, large language model hooked up to it. In the ideal case, we'd have an end-to-end endless feedback loop from target to experiment and back again, or sample to sequence and back again. There's a catch though. That's that data ingestion portion. You simply can't do AI anything without good, clean data under the surface. And that manifests itself, I think, as everyone or most advisors saying, you need to adopt a data first approach. You're probably saying, hey, wait, whoa, clean data first approach. I thought I already had that in my LIMS. What's happening? In order to get the data you have right now into an AI, you first need to make it something that an AI can read. That means you need to have the data and the metadata stored together in a machine readable format. You need to clean it up into what's referred to as structured or semantic data. That is data that's structured and stored in such a way that a machine can resolve it, understand it, read it, understand what each data element is, who captured it, and a whole host of other things about it to make sure that the AI is using that data correctly. There are solutions, and you can use them today with the software you probably already have, but there's some caveats that come with them. The whole point of managing samples and specimens is to rigorously capture data about those samples and specimens for eventual reuse, whether that's AI or simply a colleague looking to sort of improve something at the intake portion of your process. It's a never-ending process of capturing the data and metadata and then figuring out how to do it just a little bit better the next day, that incremental improvement that all of science is built on. I'm going to present these as roadblocks and then we're going to flip them into solutions, so bear with me. These are the three biggest roadblocks I've seen today from existing informatics approaches to capturing and storing sample data for subsequent reuse across all of these conversations I'm having. So first, data is often siloed. That's supposed to be a farm silo, excuse the icon. Siloed away from its metadata or as part of that software. This is an implicit part of using and programming with on top of relational databases, which are not machine readable by anything other than the software that the data was captured in. There are exceptions to this, but as a rule, right, particularly with older pieces of software. And that's because the data model is not stored in a way that can be separated from the software itself or shipped along without that software. There, there are exceptions to this, but the prevalence of companies running multiple different LIMSs all at the same time just to keep that data accessible is a dead giveaway that we're running into a pretty major roadblock or challenge in this space. The second, different parts of your end-to-end process are captured in different tools, and you have to link that data captured from one tool or in one tool to another tool. And even if those tools are operationally linked together, you probably still need to have that information extracted out of those tools and into yet another tool like a data warehouse in order to start to be able to really link them together as you think about them. How does this precursor result in this product, for example? Because those links that you want to define, they're simply not possible in a lot of sample and specimen management systems. Some of them they can, and some of them they do a very good job of it. But that operational software linkage is kind of the source of that challenge. And then the third is learning how to make your informatics software stack work for you. As a software person, I know full well the fastest way to start using software is to look around for the hard edges of that software, those pieces that just can't be changed, and then figure out how to work around them and start to make them work for you. And the computer scientist in me dies a little bit each time because that software is supposed to work for you. You're not supposed to change to work the software, if that makes sense. Don't presume that the workflow that's out of the box in a piece of software is the best one or shouldn't be improved or changed. And most folks I talk to do a really good job of this. It's that square peg in a round hole problem. But enough about challenges. Let's flip these into solutions. First problem to the problem of machine readability. You can start to add metadata to your data sets right now to make them easier to work with in the future. You're never going to achieve full provenance and explainable AI in this use case, for example, but you're going to be able to realize a sizable fraction of the value that's within your data, for example. So you could add a good machine readable structure on top of that existing data using a tool like, for example, schema.org. It's not the only one, but it's one that's relatively easy to use. Secondly, you can start to look at reducing the number of in-use tools. I mentioned earlier that the lines between these tools that we're talking about, they're getting increasingly blurry, and that's because most vendors are trying to expand their software offerings to support an end-to-end process within their tool ecosystem so that you can have those links. So for example, a lot of LIMSs these days now start including freezer management. So your first step here would be to reach out to the vendors you already have and say, hey, is there a way you can help me obsolete tool A, B, or C? I speak from experience as a salesperson at a vendor when I say, I love it when someone comes up and says, hey, can you do? Because that's an opportunity for us to figure out how to solve a challenge in a space. And then what's interesting about coming to your existing vendors is you're probably going to get a heck of a deal compared to a net new software purchase or building one, because slightly expanding the existing use of tools that you already have is invariably cheaper than a whole net new one where you've got to train and change manage and get it through procurement, for example. And then you're also already using the data models you've got in place. And then for the final case of making your software work for you, I find the best approach is to evaluate all of the software you have on hand, identify the most flexible ones, and kind of double down on those. In the case of Labit, we designed it to be flexible enough to be able to manage not only samples and specimens, but also storage, inventories, or anything else that you can imagine, real or virtual, that you want to manage in your lab in a workflow. Whichever one you choose, just make sure it's got a great API and start engaging with the vendor to learn how far you can push it. Again, from experience, every vendor out there is going to be really excited to see how far you can push their software. And if you need some kind of incentive for them, just suggest, hey, we'd be willing to contribute to a case study, and they're going to jump right in and start helping you out. All of these solutions to making your data more reusable and your life better in laboratories still come with a mandatory data cleanup step before you can reuse your data in an AI system, for example, or perhaps even over in another laboratory, depending on how it's structured and what systems they use. And that's costly in human terms because it requires our intelligence to perform that kind of data cleanup work, typically. And at the end of the day, they're not a comprehensive solution because a lot of these systems were initially designed before the type of work and data reuse we're even talking about right now was even possible or even envisioned in some cases. So when we, Semaphore Solutions, were starting to develop our software, when we finally said, hey, enough is enough, we're going to develop a new product, right from a blank sheet, not a line of code written yet. One of my colleagues, right at the start of this development cycle, asked a really interesting question. He said, what if we could just skip that data cleanup step? Like, why do we even need to do it? What if we just skip it entirely? And that spawned a lot of really interesting research and development, put us on the path to I'll say infinitely flexible. It's a bit hyperbolic, but it's extremely flexible sample specimen and data management platform we're calling Labit. In development, we reframed this question as, is there technology out there that, if leveraged in a new informatics platform, would ensure that the data captured by that informatics platform was explicitly, or more specifically, by design, semantic data? And the answer is yes. The information scientists of the world have an enormous body of work that you can leverage to ensure that your data is machine and human readable. As a whole, it's referred to as the semantic web. You might have heard of it as fair data. They're kind of related in an interesting way. But practically speaking, it's a different way of storing data and metadata together so that a machine can answer a question and tell you why it answered the question that way. When we built Labit, we leveraged the most accepted and best standards that we could, identify in order to ensure that we were able to fully comply with fair data requirements. For those unfamiliar, fair data is a set of requirements which, when satisfied, ensures that your data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or in effect, future-proof. To satisfy the fair requirements, we had to choose three things, the things on the screen right now. It required us to use a semantic knowledge graph database rather than a relational one. That is a database that stores information not in tables linked to other tables, but rather in a relationship first kind of a way. So for example, the sentence, Eben, meaning Eben presented future proofs informatics. That's subject, predicate, object. That's a sentence. It's also, coincidentally, a triple, which itself is the fundamental unit of storage inside of a graph database. Graph databases therefore naturally store information in the way that humans and therefore labs tend to think about it. So for example, analyte A1 was derived from precursor B. It's even human readable. So that's really nice to work with when you're starting to think about querying and how can we run inference across this data store. That's not enough though, because you also need to have provenance. You need to know the provenance of that data in question, the lineage, if you will. How did it come to be? Who created it and who's changed it? That digital chain of custody. There's a standard for that already out there called W3 Prov. You might be familiar with their other work. It's everything that starts with a www on the internet. This piece is a foundational one because it forms the trust foundation of our semantic data. It provides a way for the world at large to reason about how they trust our data. And the final piece of this picture, the sort of trifecta of what makes an application a semantic web application, is ontologies and vocabularies, which are kind of derivatives of the same thing. It's a deep subject. I'm going to avoid the entire TED talk, but it's a critical one. So at the highest level, an ontology is a data model specific to a domain that's published and available for others to leverage. Reuse your work without releasing the IP, for example. It's version controlled, backwards compatible, and allows for everyone who uses it to know for certain and beyond any measure of doubt that they're talking about the same thing when they say protein ABC, for example. There's an incredibly large body of work out there already and able to be used with your data. Just search for biomedical ontology and you're going to end up on BioPortal. There's thousands of ontologies available for you to use if you want. Things like the protein ontology, the gene ontology, to things like SNOMED and LOINC codes if you're in the diagnostic space. And then to use them with a semantic data, all you really need to do is put in a single line reference saying this data field is this type, and magically everybody knows exactly what it is, again, beyond any measure of a doubt. Vocabularies are described in the same way as ontologies, but instead of standardizing, vocabularies instead aim to standardize the description of specific types of data, where ontologies aim to model complex domains and how they interrelate so that you can do things like reasoning, inference, and in this particular use case, AI. So why isn't everyone using it already? It's a great question. Why don't I have fantastic AI already? I can answer the first, and the second one, a little outside my area of expertise, and I'm not even going to touch that one. It comes down to a lot of things, and we felt the impact of them whenever we built the LIMS that leveraged all of the semantic web technologies, which is a kind way of saying it cost us a lot more money to build it than we initially thought it would. The result's worthwhile, though. So the first reason is a simple one, performance. It's the most common thing I hear back from people in the know that's they're like, hey, knowledge graphs, they're not performant. What the heck? Uh, it's only in the last decade or so that knowledge graph databases based on RDF have become performant enough to be an application's primary data store. That's where everything ends up at the end of the day under the hood. We performance modeled our application lab it on top of an RDF graph database, onto text graph DB if you're interested, into the space of many billions of entities, pushing up really high against the boundary and getting into things like trillions, not quite there yet. It exhibited linear performance curve all the way across on read, which is really the important one from a software perspective. The second reason is one of inertia. The skills and knowledge of the builders of software today focus on where the vast majority of the work is, which is where the vast majority of the world's software is built on, which is in this case SQL databases again. That in turn has a gravitational pull all its own. At the end of the day, relational databases, they're widely understood, and I'll be honest and very, very frank, they're good enough for some, if not most applications, particularly of late with the layering on of semantic data tooling on top of relational databases. It's not quite totally there yet, in my opinion, but people are getting there. And then the third reason is a simple one of economics. Existing software certainly could be re-architected to support semantic data, but that would require significant quantities of investment. Refer to my previous statement. SQL capabilities are frequently good enough. At the risk of being cynical, it might be easier to just start a business to help you clean and ingest data into LLMs than it is to build a new LIMS business. And I say this from knowledge because we just built a LIMS business and it has not been easy, but it's been very rewarding. So what are the key takeaways from all of this? This is the line that gets me to perk up in any webinar that I'm sitting in. So this is the point at which, everybody should pay attention. The number one takeaway, you've got to find time to engage with data science or informatics folks as they come up to you in the laboratory and start talking. They're trying to help, and yeah, it might seem like a useless effort to define this vocabulary and that ontology on top of your data. You don't understand why, because, oh my goodness, I just need to capture the data, and fair enough. But that's only because the intersectionality of sales skills and data scientists is vanishingly small, and I don't know that even I'm doing it a very good service here. The number two takeaway, if you do nothing else, please read about the fair data principles and start asking your vendors for them. There are many ways to implement fair data, but even one incremental step along the path to fair data is a step towards more reusable data and therefore a more future-proof data strategy supporting your sample and specimen management. And the number three takeaway is leverage that natural software re-platforming cycle to your benefit. Add a requirement to your list for new software that requires that software to be fair data compliant. And consider searching outside of just LIMS. You don't necessarily need a LIMS. That's a very particular product that's being sold. What you need is an end-to-end sample and specimen management capability that tracks lineage and chain of custody and signatures throughout the whole thing. And critically, one that matches the needs of your organization. Have a look for newer software platforms out there. We exist, and we might not exactly fit the mold of the old requirements that you're utilizing, but we might have a new way of handling those challenges. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a quote. It's from a 2022 paper by Scheffler et al. The predicted changes brought about by a fair data infrastructure will not replace scientists, but scientists who use such an infrastructure may replace those who don't. I highly recommend reading it. I can send that around later if that's interesting to folks. So I've talked a lot about these abstract challenges. I'm right up on time. This is all from us building a new laboratory informatics platform. I just want to point out, it's not a theoretical platform. It's available to solve problems today. Here are two screenshots of what it looks like, history and lineage on the left-hand side, and then a live view of what you'd be working with in the laboratory if you want to see visually what's going on. It's capable of managing any workflow you can imagine. You can define those boxes and arrows to be anything you want, from sample and specimen management all the way through to things like document equipment quality and more. I've got a theoretical example doing non-conformance events right now that we're working on. And it's all done utilizing a fully fair data compliant semantic knowledge graph database that has full digital provenance in place. This is Labit as it's used in laboratories right now, validated to the highest standards and compliant with all of your favorite three-letter agencies and not the scary ones, thankfully. Well, that's subjective. Thanks for your time, everyone. I hope you found my talk useful. I look forward to connecting with you all in the future. I'll leave this slide up and open the floor to any questions if we have time. John, Aaron, let me know how I did.
Yeah, we've got time for one or two questions. Let me just see what's so you've got some folks excited. They're posting different things, thanking you. You real quick, do you want to just touch on the BPM part of this, right? That everyone can see and explain that to folks, and then if no other questions come in, we'll go to the next speaker.
Happy to. So in the screenshot you're seeing in behind here, the live view screenshot, the workflow in there is not something we created. It's using business process modeling notation. That is actually an ISO standard that visually presents workflows and is designed to generically handle any analysis situation that a business analyst might encounter across any number of sectors. Fundamentally, that you don't need to use Labit to create these things. So you may already have it, particularly if you're in a large company, business analysts who are utilizing BPMN to already document processes. There are kind of a couple of major advantages, and the reason we chose this. One, it can obviously manage the workflows and theoretically any workflow, to my point about like document equipment, Kappa, NCE, take your pick. But also it's got a really beautiful tie-in to provenance, right? So a BPMN activity tracks to a provenance activity. And so it gives us this beautiful prospective, retrospective ability to say, here is what we are going to do in perhaps like the form of an SOP or breaking up an SOP into its various chunks to create a workflow. And then saying, this is prospectively what we're going to do. And all of that is versioned as a whole thing. This is the version of this particular protocol, method, or SOP that we're utilizing. And then retrospectively capture the data about that piece. Yeah, that's how we manage workflow. It's not unique to us. There's 1,000 different tools that you can use to create BPMNs, but Labit uses them natively. So you can just import them if you already have them.
All right. Thanks, Iban. Very, very great talk. Great job.
Thank
And
you.
we'll look forward to talking to you in the roundtable.
Until then.